Are you ready? Here we go. We're talking about replacement theology, which, as I said, it turns Yeshua from this into this. No wonder the Jews don't recognize him. And as I said before, he's got a bad case of arthritis. And almost every one of his paintings, you notice a little hand arthritis thing? The Catholics, they don't want to always love everybody and include everybody. But that hand movement that they painted there in probably the 4th century or whatever comes from Hinduism and from Buddhism. That little hand thing was from 2000 BC. The Hare Krishnas did that. And of course, it was about 500 million Buddhists, and around 500 BC, they came up with the same thing. And then, of course, now, with replacement theology, we've come up with this, and then we often wonder, how come the Jews don't recognize them? I wonder. Okay, so what we're talking about, what I mean by replacement theology, the focus this time is on wrong theology when it comes concerning the Shabbats, the feasts, the commandments, what ecclesia or ecclesia means. The names have been changed. Yeshua now becomes Jesus. Yochanan, the immerser, becomes John the Baptist. Okay, all the names have changed. The word Jesus, or the name Jesus, if you'd have asked where's Jesus 2,000 years ago there, no one would have any idea who you're talking about, because there's no J's in Hebrew. There's no J's in Greek, and there wasn't even a J in English until the 1600s. Jesus is a transliteration. You guys know the difference between a transliteration and a translation. A transliteration, they just take the phonics and put it in the other language, not what it means. If I were to ask you what Jesus' name means in Hebrew, it's not in Hebrew. There is no name. But Yeshua in Hebrew means salvation. And so Yeshua has a meaning that you lose when you translate it from Hebrew. Now, Yeshua, here's the thing. How many of you know Spanish? How about in South Korean or other languages, you have male and female? Okay, like male and female genders. Well, in Hebrew, it's the same thing. Yeshua is feminine. And so when they translate it into the Greek, if they transliterate it, it would be feminine, so they changed it to Jesus. That made it masculine. And so from Jesus, it went into Greek or to English as Jesus when they invented the letter J. It wasn't, no one in the early church for 1,000 years had ever heard of Jesus. They never heard of Jesus for the first 1,500 years. It wasn't until they started, the printing press was invented, and they started putting it, and even then it was an I, it wasn't a J, and it became a J until the 1600s. So anyway, it's a transliteration of a Hebrew word. So, not only has the names changed, like John the Baptist. Who knows, what does John mean? Okay, well, John in Hebrew comes from the word Yochanan. Now, what does Yochanan mean? God is gracious. Hi, I'm God is gracious. And how many of you want that name? But because of replacement theology, we've changed it to John, which has no meaning whatsoever. Not only has the names changed, the priesthood has changed. Now, this is what the priest would look like, but now we have cardinals and different things, and they look completely different. They're not the sons of Aaron were to get married. In the Catholic Church, nobody gets married. The commandments of God have now been obliterated. They're done away with. The Hebrew language, the language of heaven, has now been ditched, and now it's a Greek text. And this poor Jesus has arthritis too. But it's gone totally to the Greek. So a lot of things have changed. As a matter of fact, here we have the ecclesia. All right, you can see the tabernacle there at the foot of the mountain with the Shekinah there. You see Moses up on the mountain. Ecclesia only meant assembly, but now It's a church. As a matter of fact, I'll go into it here in a minute. How many of you have heard, before I go there, let me say this. The Shabbat has changed, okay? Also, the calendar has changed. Everything's changing. But let me tell you a little bit of, let me go here. The capital has changed. It used to be in Jerusalem, and now it's in Rome. I mean, everything is changing. And a lot of people say, I don't believe in replacement theology, and yet they still go to a place that teaches replacement theology. Here you see, look at that. Instead of Shabbat being the seventh day of the week, Sunday's now a day of the week. I went on the internet, grabbed a calendar for January of this year, and Sunday is the last day of the week. The holidays have changed. Passover has become the Easter bunny. As a matter of fact, all over you find every year helicopters, churches get involved bringing helicopters, dropping eggs. Okay, the holiday, this is what I talk about being replacement theology. Now, let me explain this. I'm going to go a little bit slower here. I'll try. I will try. I want you to see this. Notice above the red, it says spring. When is spring in 2024? This next spring begins on Tuesday, March 19th, and goes all the way through June. That's 3 months. We have 4 seasons. Well, in Kansas we do. I don't know about here. But there's 4 seasons, and so that's 3 different times. 2 times 4 is 12. So every season gets 3 months, and spring is March 19th through June 20th. That is all spring. Well, guess what? I don't know if you knew this, but astronomically speaking, the first day of spring is marked by the spring equinox, which always falls on March 19th, 20th, or 21st every year. And then the equinox happens at the same moment worldwide, but obviously it's different times around the world. So we said March 19th, so go to March 19th, right there. I'll put it in spring. Spring begins on March 19th this year. Now, when does the full moon occur on a biblical calendar? Remember, the new moon, is the first day of a month, and then 2 weeks later is a full moon, which would be the 15th of a month. And if you'll notice, this is the 15th day of Adar. Does everybody see that? And that's when Purim is, the month before Passover. So let's put the full moon there. Boom, there's the full moon, right? Is everyone following me? According to the Catholics and all of Christianity, Easter is always on the first Sunday after the full moon. So boom, there is Easter. Now, and that's when Easter falls in 2024. Now, here's the thing. What always is supposed to happen before Easter? He's supposed to die. He's got to die before he resurrects. Following me? Does that make sense? Well, if that's Easter, that means he died on Good Friday. But Good Friday is the 19th of Adar. I thought he's supposed to die on Nisan 14. But what does Christianity do? They all celebrate next year. It's always different. The 19th of Adar as his death, and the 21st of Adar as Easter. Does it make sense? Messiah is supposed to die on a full moon. Passover is always what? Nisan 14, Nisan 15. God wanted him to die on a full moon because the Hebrew word for moon is the same Hebrew word for throne. He's the king of Israel. Okay, so he's supposed to die on a full moon. But in Christianity, he doesn't die on the full moon. He dies on the first Sunday after the full moon of spring. Okay, now notice it's the 31st. So let's go to the next month of 2024. Here he is, the Easter Bunny up there at the top in Adar. Well, what happens? He's supposed to die on the full moon, Nisan 14, Nisan 15. Isn't that what the Bible says? Okay, so that being the case, right there is when we would celebrate the resurrection or the first fruits. And what does the Bible say? observe the month of Aviv, which means spring, or now it's Nisan, and keep the Passover unto the Lord your God, for in the month of Aviv, or spring, or Nisan, the Lord your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. Wow. So what is happening? They're celebrating his resurrection a month before he dies. How in the world can Christianity celebrate the resurrection a month before he dies? The problem is, it doesn't say in the Bible that Easter is the first Sunday after the vernal equinox. And it doesn't say it's on any random day in the month of Adar. Okay? And that is still spring. He's supposed to die in the spring. And the spring may begin with Adar, but he's not to die till the month of Nisan in the spring. And it has to happen on the full moon. That's what replacement theology does. It says the devil, or the Antichrist, wants to change the times and the seasons, so you miss the divine appointments. That's the purpose. You don't have the connection with God that is different. It's like an open portal to heaven. And if you're meeting at different days and different times, you're going to miss the meeting. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so here we are again. Ecclesia. What does that mean? Assembly. It does not mean church. As a matter of fact, how many of you have heard of the Septuagint? Okay, September, although it's the 9th month, it's supposed to be the 7th month because sept is 7, oct is 8th. Okay, but the calendar got all screwed up, and that's a whole nother sermon, how that happened. But here's the thing. The Septuagint, you think of 70 translators. There are actually 72 Jewish sages who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And the reason that happened was because there were so many Hellenistic Jews living that didn't know Hebrew, they only knew Greek. And they wanted the Hebrew translated into the Greek. Well, what happened? These translators were sent to Alexandria, Egypt, by the chief priest of Jerusalem, whose name was Eleazar. But guess what? It was at the request of Ptolemy II, the head of Egypt. And guess when the Septuagint was translated? In the 3rd century BC. We're talking about 260 BC is when there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew. How many of you know there were no churches in 260 BC? That makes sense? Okay, well, guess what? The Septuagint, again, is not the original Hebrew, but it was the main translation. That Greek translation was the main translation that was the basis for the Latin, the Coptic, the Ethiopic, the Armenian, the Georgian, the Slavonic, and part of the Arabic translations of the Old Testament. Okay, so they did not use the original Hebrew to translate into the Latin and all these other languages. They used the Greek. And obviously, Greek isn't correct. Everything else is going to be messed up. All right? But the Greek has always been the standard version of the Old Testament in the Greek church. How many have heard of St. Jerome? Okay, St. Jerome used the Greek version to begin his translation of the Vulgate Old Testament in the almost 400 AD. So we're talking 400 years later is when St. Jerome translated it into the Latin. Spanish and English translations came in the late 1500s, 1,500 years later. Now I'm going to make a comment that's going to blow everybody away. Did you know, this first one's going to be easy. How many of you know there were no churches in the Old Testament? How many of you know there were no churches in the New Testament? There were no churches in the New Testament. What? What about the 7 churches in Revelation? Translation error. Okay. First, let me explain. There were only assemblies. Yes, there were assemblies. Yes, there were believers. But they were assemblies, and guess where they met? In the synagogue. As a matter of fact, look at Acts 13, verse 14 and 15. when they departed from Perga and they came to Antioch in Pisidia, they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down after the reading of the law and the prophets. That's the Torah and the Haftarah, okay? It says, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them and saying, hey, you visitors, you men and brethren, do you have any word of exhortation for everybody? Tell us what it is. Where is Antioch and where is Pisidia in this verse? What country? Turkey. It's not even in Israel. In a nation outside of Israel, there are Jews and non-Jews meeting on the Sabbath day in synagogues together. Look at the next verse, Acts 13, 42 through 44. This is just down the road from verse 14 and 15. And when the Jews had left the synagogue, the Gentiles who were still in there besought that these words might be preached to them the next what? And that wasn't Sunday. Okay, and now when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. And then the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. Jews, Gentiles, they're all coming on the Sabbath, and they're meeting in synagogues together. Look at Acts 14:1. And they came to pass in Iconium. Where's Iconium? Turkey. They went both together into the synagogue of the Jews and spoke, and a great multitude of both Jews and also of the Greeks believed. Here again, Jews and Gentiles meeting in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Look at Acts 17:2. And Paul, as his manner was, went into them, and 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them out of the Scripture. So again, they always met on the Sabbath. They always met in the synagogue. Look at Acts 17:4. It goes on to say, and some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and the devout Greeks were how many? A great multitude, and of the chief women, not a few. All the Gentiles, they didn't start a Sunday church. They came to the synagogue on Shabbat. Then he goes over to Athens, and from Athens, Greece, he goes to Corinth. So here again, they're in another nation. They're not in Israel. And in Acts 18:4, it says he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Wow, what's going on here? Well, here's the thing. Let me show you this. Confirming there were no churches in the New Testament, only assemblies. Look at this. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It wasn't built until the year 335 when Constantine okayed it. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre wasn't made until, that's the first church in Jerusalem. And it was 335 AD. It wasn't in the first century or even the second century. And then they just found a church in Aqaba. Aqaba Church is a historic, again, 3rd century, think Constantine church located in Aqaba, Jordan. It was unearthed in 1998 by a group of archaeologists, and it is considered to be the world's oldest known purpose-built Christian church. Its first phase was dated, between 293 and 303, which makes it older than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and older than the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which were built in the late 320s. There were no churches. There was only groups of people in a synagogue, and the Jews and the Greeks met together, and they were called assemblies. Now, who knows where Aqaba is? Who doesn't know where Aqaba is? Who is confused whether they know where Aqaba is? Okay. Aqaba is down here in Jordan. A lot, which is at the very bottom, 9 miles away is Aqaba. And a couple miles away is where we're going to be this October. We're going to go right through Aqaba to get down here to where we're going to stay at this resort on our trip. So, but anyway, the Septuagint Oh, well, let me go back. Acts 7:38. Look at this. Acts is the New Testament. Am I right? And look what it says. Talking about Moses. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness. What? In 1500 BC there was a church? I don't think so. Guess what the word is there? Ecclesia. They decided ecclesia should be translated as church. All right? But there's a problem with that. Look at Acts 19:32. This is where they were worshiping the great goddess Diana for several hours. And in Acts 19:32, some of them cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused. Well, guess what? The word is ecclesia, but they go, oops, we can't put church in because they'll think the church was confused and the church are worshiping Diana. So we're going to translate it like it's supposed to be as assembly. And then in Acts 19:39, it says, if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it'll be determined in a lawful assembly. And guess what the Greek word is? Ecclesia. But we can't put church here now again because they'll think that the church was the one that was worshiping the great goddess Diana. How many of you believe the media is biased? So were the translators. Do you know in the Septuagint, which was written when? A couple hundred years before the New Testament, the word ecclesia is there over 98 times. And yet there were no churches. So ecclesia never meant church. It always meant what? Assembly. Yes, there were believing assemblies. Some people think, what? You don't believe in the church? Yes, I believe in the assembly of believers. But the media uses words that have other meanings. How many of you know they try to manipulate you through words? Well, the translators into English were just as biased. Just like there's bias today and prejudice today. That's why you always want to go back to the original text. Now, let me give you another example. This is one of my favorite examples of what replacement theology has done to us. How many of you like the begats? How many of you focus on the begats? Man, I memorized all the begats. I love the begats. The problem with the begats for Christians is the words. In Genesis 5, it mentions the begats. Adam begat Seth, who begat Enosh, who begat Canaan, who begat Mahalalel, who begat Yared, who begat Enoch, who begat Methuselah, who begat Lamech, who begat Noah. And how many of you got anything out of that? Oh, good. One of you did. Okay, the problem is in the English, we transliterate, we don't translate. And what's the difference between transliterate and translate? Transliterate is take the phonics and put them into your language. Translate means to give the meaning of the name. Adam in Hebrew means mankind. Hi, I am mankind. Remember Cain killed Abel? And Seth was appointed to take his place, it says. As a matter of fact, I think I have that in your Bible. Or in the Bible, let me see. Oh, I did put it in there. But anyway, it says in Genesis that Seth was appointed to take Abel's place. Well, guess what Seth's name means? He's appointed to. Hi, I'm appointed to. That's what his name is. But we don't put in the English what the translation is, and so we miss the whole meaning of these names. He begat Enosh, which means feeble, frail, mortal. He begat Canaan, which means a fixed dwelling place, like a house compared to a tent. So here in English, we go Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan. But in Hebrew, I just said mankind is appointed to feeble, frail mortality, a fixed dwelling place. All of a sudden, it has meaning. He begat Mahalalel. That means God who is praised. Who begat Yared, which means to come down or descend. He begat Enoch. How many of you heard of Hanukkah? Enoch comes from Hanukkah, and Enoch means to train or instruct, to be a teacher. You're instructing and training. Then we have Methuselah, okay, Shalach, where you get, Shalach means to be shot forth or sent forth, okay? Mech is death. So that Methuselah means he's sent to die. And he died a week before the flood. Lamech means to be beaten and tortured. Noah means to bring rest, a quiet peace. So now when you say these 10 generations in Hebrew, you're saying mankind is appointed to feeble, frail, mortality, fixed dwelling place. God, who is praised, comes down to instruct us. He was sent to die, being beaten and tortured to bring us rest and a quiet peace. You are not going to get that in the English. You're only going to get that from the Hebrew. I love the begats. There's so many amazing things, but that's what replacement theology has done to us. Now, Passover, again. Replacement theology has messed that all up. They'll celebrate the resurrection a month before he dies. So this is why replacement theology is very important, to understand all of the traditions of things that are going on. In Exodus 12, verse 15 on your notes, it says 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. The first day you're to put away the leaven out of your house. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that soul will be cut off from Israel. That's pretty serious, okay? Well, let's look at this. What they would do, because of that statement, a few days before that cutoff came, they would begin to get all the leaven out of their house, preparing themselves for the feast of unleavened bread. And so what they would do, they would take, in Hebrew, it's known as Bedekat Chametz, the removal of the leaven. And so you can see a picture of Dad here, and he's got a child, a little daughter there, and he has a candle, and he takes a wooden spoon, and he's got a feather and a linen cloth, and Mom purposely hides some leaven. You can see the leaven down here. So Mom purposely hides the leaven, and then Dad gets a candle and he lights it, and the children have the feather and the wooden spoon and the linen cloth, and then the kids find it. And so after they find it, he says, okay, we got to remove the leaven. It says in the Bible that they were to teach their children about Passover, so they incorporate this in it to make it fun and memorable for the kids. So as soon as the kid reaches out to touch the leaven, Dad goes, no, don't you touch it. Dad says, let me handle it. And he takes the feather out and he scoops the little crumb and puts it on the wooden spoon. Then he wraps it in a linen cloth and they take it outside. So here we have the tools needed: the candle, which is the light of the Torah. The feather, that's the Holy Spirit with its wings. The leaven, that's our sin. The wooden spoon, that represents the cross. The linen cloth represents what he's been wrapped in, and then he's taken outside of the camp and he's buried. And there's a communal burnt offering. All the Jews, basically to this day, it's called what is called the Bir Chametz, which is the burning of the leaven. Everybody in the neighborhood, there'd be one leaven pile. And they take all the leaven after they do that, even this day, and they put it in a pile and they burn it because they want to get all the leaven out of the house before Passover. All right? If you don't know the Jewish traditions, you don't realize it. They know the traditions, but they don't realize what it pertains to. See, so both the Christians have one eye open, and the Jews have one eye open, and the first group to look through both of them gets to see the whole picture. But the prejudice keeps us away from seeing the other side. Let me see. Do you remember when Jesus drove all the money changers out of the temple? Can anyone tell me what month of the year that was? What month do you think Jesus drove all the money changers out of the temple? He's got his whip out. He's driving all the money changers out. It was at Passover. He's getting the leaven out of his dad's house. You will never forget that. Okay? So the whole idea was, oh, thank you. He was getting leaven out of the house. He was doing the very thing all the Jews have done traditionally for 1,500 years before he came. Isn't that amazing? That whole idea of getting leaven out of the house is where it got the concept of spring cleaning. That's what it came from. Now get a load of this. John 2, 13 and 15, there it is. And the Jews Passover was at hand. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. He found the temple, those selling oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, the sheep, the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. It was a Passover. Now you will never forget when that happened. He's cleaning the leaven out of his dad's house. Now, get a load of this. If you remember, what day were they to grab the Passover lamb? The 10th of Nisan. Passover's the 14th, but on the 10th of Nisan, they were to take their lamb, and what were they to do for 4 days? They had to inspect the lamb. Nisan 10, they brought the lamb home, and then for 4 days they inspected it. This is back in the original Exodus. Okay. Well, look at this. Matthew 26, 59 and 60. They've taken Yeshua from the Mount of Olives, and it says, now the chief priests, the elders, all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but they what? Found none. Though many false witnesses came, they found none. And at the last came these two false witnesses. Look at Luke 23, 4. He comes. Well, first off, here he is. All these scribes and priests are trying to find false witnesses, but they find no fault in him. Then he comes before Herod and Pilate. And it says in Luke 23, 4, then said Pilate to the chief priests, I find no fault in this man. Verse 15, no, nor yet Herod, for I said you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. And then when we go to the thief on the cross in Luke 23, 41, it says, we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing amiss. So we see Yeshua during the exact time of the inspection of the lamb was found to be a lamb without blemish. And it happened at the very time of the inspection of the lamb. And what's interesting, the lamb was held for how many days? And 4,000 years, and the day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, was when Messiah came. There's all of these connections. Now, let me see where I'm at. Here's the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's a picture. These are 2,000-year-old trees. Many of these may have been just little olive trees back in Yeshua's day. How many of you have been to the Garden of Gethsemane? I think we're going to be going there this October. Okay, now, look at this. I think everyone knows this verse. Matthew 26, 30. It's at the Last Supper. They sang a hymn and they went out to the Mount of Olives. They sang a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. Anyone have any idea the words to that song? You all know the words? Does anybody not know the words to the song that they sang? When you get rid of replacement theology, you know. First off, guess what? The Lord had King David compose the funeral hymns that would be sung at Yeshua's funeral 1,000 years in advance. That's right. The hymns, the Psalms, was their songbook. And the Hallel is what they would sing every Passover, which is Psalms 113 through Psalms 118. So Psalm 118 was the last hymn at the Last Supper. Because that is the last hymn that's been sung at the Last Supper for 2,000 years. Or more since David, 3,000 years. All right. So, what do we find in Psalm 118? I think it's interesting. Do you remember, here they sang a hymn and they went over to the Mount of Olives, right? And that's where he was betrayed. That's where he was rejected. So what was the final hymn that they sang before he went over to the Mount of Olives? Psalm 118, 22 through 24. The stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Wow, that's the very words when he was betrayed. And they sing it 3 times a day. And the following morning, at 9 in the morning, it says in Mark that it was at 9 in the morning the 3rd hour of the day, that they crucified him. Well, guess what? 9 in the morning, the very moment they nailed him to the stake, is the time of the morning sacrifice. At that very same moment, you can see the high priest there, and they take the Passover lamb that's going to be slain at 3 in the evening. They tie him, they bind him to the altar. So at the very moment that he's being nailed to the cross at 9 in the morning, Josephus says there were 2 million Jews there all around Jerusalem. They were all a choir singing. As Yeshua is being nailed to the cross, what does he hear everybody singing? Psalm 118. The Lord is God. He's given us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords, even to the horns of the altar. That's what they're singing while they're nailing him to the cross. That's what they're singing while they're binding the Passover lamb to the altar. And then what do we see? At noon, that's when all the lights go out. At high noon, everything goes black for 3 hours. And while he's suspended between heaven and earth, he hears everybody singing. And what are they singing? Psalm 118, the right hand of the Lord is lifted up. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. That's what he's singing, where they've lifted him up in the air. And then at 3 in the evening is the time of the evening sacrifice. And that's when he dies. And so, boom, it's 3 o'clock. And as he gives his last breath, what is he hearing everyone sing? Let Israel now say, his loving kindness endures forever. Let Aaron in the house say, his loving kindness endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his loving kindness endures forever. 1,000 years before King David had him write this song, 1,000 years before he came. Now, these kinds of things with replacement theology, you don't connect. As a matter of fact, how many of you remember the veil of the temple rent from top to bottom? Remember that? Well, let me show you something. This is an ancient painting. It's called a Kehilat. It's where Jacob is tearing his clothes while the 11 sons say Joseph died, right? Well, he thinks Joseph got torn by beasts. And so what does he do? Kehilat is the rending of the garments where he's tearing his clothes, revealing a broken heart over the death of his son. That's what the veil of the temple was. He was rending his garment, the father, over the death of his son. That was the purpose of the rending of the veil. Now, here's the other thing. Josephus records 250,000 lambs were slain for Passover. That's 250,000 lambs. There were 2.5 million people in Jerusalem, 10 people to a lamb. You got 250,000 lambs. Now, I don't know how much blood a lamb has, but if there's 250,000 lambs and they have 1 quart, that's 62,500 gallons of blood. That's equivalent to over 1,155-gallon barrels. Now, in the temple, where they're slaying it, where's all that blood going to go? They'd be swimming in blood. At the base of the altar, there were 4 holes, channels, that before the blood coagulated, while it's hot and liquid, they would throw it down those holes, drain holes, and they would go underneath the temple where there were giant cisterns. Let me show you this. There are 3 valleys. There's the Kidron, everyone's familiar with, next to the Mount of Olives. That's the Valley of Blood, the Hinnom Valley, because that's where all the blood went. The Dung Gate is on this end of the temple, and it went downhill, and it's called the Dung Gate because that's where all the sewage and everything went. And so all this blood is like a river flowing down into the Valley of Blood. Okay? That's the Tyropian Valley in the middle, which is now gone because it's been filled with dirt and there's Muslim houses built on it. But here's the thing. He died on the Mount of Olives. He didn't die in the back 40. Okay, so he's looking into his father's face, and that's why the father, when he sees his son, rends his garment. Underneath, they found all these cisterns. Some of these cisterns would hold 10,000 gallons of water. And it'd be like flushing the toilet, okay? All that blood's going down there. They release the water from the cistern, and there'd be a gigantic river of blood and water that is flowing into the Valley of Blood. And so at the very moment Yeshua, blood and water, is flowing from his right side, There's a massive flow, a river of blood and water falling from the Father's right side. He's in the Holy of Holies. And I'll close with these two verses. I think it's interesting. The Torah portion today is a kev, not kov, which means heel. And look at Psalm 41:9. It's really all about the death of Messiah. It says, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which ate of my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And then look at John 13:18. The Messiah refers to that very verse. I speak not of you all, I know whom I've chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. And this is why he shared the bread with Judas. But with that said, that just is a touch of what replacement theology has done. It's erased all the connections of the names being translated, of the Passover. And this is why the Easter bunny instead of the Messiah. And this is why he can resurrect before he dies. But with that, let's stand.